Good afternoon. I want to focus on the sources of inequality in the lives of children and young people. And I want to illustrate some of these patterns using research based on data from Scotland, including the Growing Up in Scotland study and the Millennium Cohort study, and Ireland, using the Growing Up in Ireland study. And I want to address 4 sets of questions. What aspects of family background matter for child outcomes, how these background factors influence child outcomes, whether living in a disadvantaged area makes a difference, and whether attending a school serving a disadvantaged population matters. Now, previous research has often focused on a single aspect of family background, such as parental education, but other research shows that different aspects of family background matter in different ways. For parental education, therefore, we expect that parents with higher levels of education will have greater cultural resources and they will be more likely to foster the kinds of home learning environments that will enhance the skills and development of their children. Parents with degree level qualifications are also more likely to have detailed knowledge of the educational system and be better able to help their children navigate their way through that system. In terms of social class, then we expect that higher social classes will have more access to long-term economic resources, higher status, and more developed social networks that can enhance their children's opportunities. When it comes to income, it matters, of course, because it allows parents to pay for goods and services that could perhaps enhance their children's access to learning, formal and informal. It affects where people can afford to live. And at the other extreme, low income can result in financial strain, thus causing stress and poor well-being. Now, what aspect of family background matters most? Here I use Millennium Cohort survey data to show the gap between the top and bottom groups in children's vocabulary at the age of 5. So from left to right, it shows the gap between the highest and lowest social class, the highest and lowest educational group, and the highest and lowest income group. What's worth noting is that here we see that the biggest gap in vocabulary is by income, with similar levels of inequality, although they are significant between social class and mother's education. When we look at older groups of young people, when we look at adolescents who are 12 or 13, and compare again the top and bottom groups for social class, education and income, we can see that the income gap at this stage isn't quite as large as the education or social class gap, but is nonetheless sizable. It's important to note that we can't expect that family background plays out in the same way across different contexts and countries, educational systems and so on. Here I draw on work with Adriana Duta to compare Irish and Scottish 5-year-olds and the kinds of inequality we see at the age of 5, again looking at their vocabulary. What's notable here is that inequality tends to be slightly greater in Scotland, the blue bar compared to the orange, but especially in relation to income. We can see that income inequality is on a par, more or less, with educational inequality in Ireland, but in Scotland it assumes a more dominant role. Now, a good deal of the discussion in the existing literature has been on whether it's important who parents are, that is, the kinds of cultural, economic and social resources they have, or what they do, that is, how they raise their child and what kinds of learning support they give to that child. Here I use Growing Up in Scotland data to show access to 2 aspects of home learning. So that is the blue bar, which shows the number of books for preschool children in the home, and the orange bar shows the proportion of children who were read to every day by their parents. And this is broken down by mother's education. So we can see that more advantaged groups are more likely to reach their children every day and are more likely to have books in the home that are suitable for preschool children. Nonetheless, it's worth noting that the majority of all mothers, regardless of their educational qualifications, read to their children every day. The key issue is, of course, is whether this makes a difference and explains the inequality that we've shown earlier. So the blue bar shows what we saw before, which is the raw difference between mothers with a degree and mothers with lower standard grades, and on the right hand side between the highest and lowest income group. The orange bar shows what happens when we take account of home learning. So when we take account of being read to every day and the number of books in the home. We can see there's very little difference. In other words, very little of the inequality gap that we've seen in vocabulary is accounted for by the home learning environment, as well as number of books and the reading, which had the strongest effects. We also take account of a number of other kinds of activities, such as practicing the alphabet or numbers and so on. And none of these close that gap. So it does seem to be important that it is who parents are, not just what they do. Now, I had said earlier that I was also going to talk about area and school factors shaping inequality. There's been a really long-running debate internationally on whether there are area or neighbourhood effects on child outcome. The key issue is whether any differences between areas are just due to the profile of families living there, or just living in a very deprived area have an additional impact on child outcomes when we take account of the profile of families. Now we will see in the next slide, using Scottish data, that taking account of family background factors does change the picture that we see of variation across areas. Here I've grouped areas into 5 groups based on the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. And this is a commonly used policy tool to target disadvantaged communities. Areas with different levels of advantage or disadvantage are contrasted here with the most deprived areas, so that the 5th of areas that have the highest deprivation scores. The blue bar shows the raw difference. So we can see that the test scores among 12 and 13-year-olds are highest in the most advantaged areas and lowest in the least advantaged areas, with a kind of natural steps of stairs or a gradient there. Well, what happens when we take account of the profile of individual families in those areas? We can see quite a shift. So we move to a picture of really seeing a contrast between the most deprived areas and all others, with little variation then between the rest of the areas. So we can see then an achievement gap for children and young people living in the most deprived areas, but that area level advantage or disadvantage makes very little difference beyond that. Now I want to turn to look at schools, and this chart bears some kind of explanation. What I've done here is use Growing Up in Scotland data to trace the development of children's skills from the age of 3 to the age of 12. So the top 2 lines show those children who started off with high scores at the age of vocabulary scores at the age of 3, and the bottom 2 lines show those who started off with low scores. In terms of those with the top scores, we see the yellow group are those who came from highly educated families, so mothers with a degree or more, and the grey shows those with lower educated families, so lower standard grades or less. And as with the top lines, the bottom lines also are broken down by levels of parental education. So we can see 2 things here. We can see that as children grow and develop and move towards primary school, that the gap fans out, if you like. So the gap increases in terms of their scores on the basis of their parental educational background. A second feature worth noting is that the group of children from graduate families who started off with low scores actually more or less reached the level of those who started off with high scores but were from less advantaged families. So we can see that coming from an advantaged family helps children make up the gap, so that more middle class or highly educated groups can compensate for their children's initially low scores to a great extent, thus kind of increasing educational inequality. As with the debate about neighbourhood effects, there's also been a debate about whether the mix of students in a school makes a difference. So is it just that some schools have more disadvantaged students, or is there an effect from having that concentration of disadvantage? And the social composition of schools is shaped by the broader environment. So in some countries, most young people attend school in their local area. Scotland would fit into that more or less, except when it comes to independent secondary schools in Edinburgh, where quite a significant minority of young people attend them. So there's active school choice there. In other cases, active school choice can break the link between the school a young person lives in and the school a young person attends and the neighbourhood they live in. And that's the case with secondary schools in Ireland, where around half of the cohort don't attend their nearest school. So I'm going to illustrate some patterns around the effects of school social mix using Irish data, but there is considerable potential to use linked administrative data in analysing Scottish survey data like Growing Up in Scotland, and I think this could be a useful direction for future research. Now here I show just students from a working class background. In blue, I show what happens when they attend a school with a concentration of other working class students, and in orange, a school that's more socially mixed. This shows the proportion taking different numbers of higher level subjects at lower secondary level. So it's a very good proxy for academic performance at this stage and later on. Now we can see on the left, there's a very large gap there where students in working class schools are much less likely to take a number of higher level subjects, so that they kind of tend to take fewer than 5, and they're much less likely than their counterparts in socially mixed schools to take 10 or more. This same pattern holds when we look at their aspirations for the future. When we look at the proportion who intend to go on to university or other forms of higher education, we can see there's a gap there between working class students in working class schools and working class students in socially mixed schools. And the gap is actually larger for the group that we call never employed. So they're a group whose families are quite far removed from the labour market. They're long-term unemployed or economically inactive, and so they can't be assigned a social class category in a traditional way. And for this group in particular, the social mix of the school makes a big difference for their intentions as to what to do after they leave school. Now, what could account for these differences? We see that from Irish research and from other research internationally that school policy and practice can come to reflect and embody the kinds of students that attend it. This has been termed institutional habitus based on the work of Bourdieu and subsequent developments. And we see that there are certain elements of practice that actually reflect the kinds of students. And we've singled out 3 main factors here. First is ability grouping. So that working class schools are more likely to use rigid ability grouping or streaming, which can set limits on young people's academic potential and performance. Secondly, career guidance can play a role in encouraging young people towards options that are seen as more feasible or suitable for different social groups. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the nature of teacher-student interaction can directly embody some of the kind of compositional issues and become entangled with teacher expectations. I have two quotes here from a mixed methods longitudinal study of secondary students in Ireland. And here the students capture their sense of frustration and their negative relationships that they have with their teachers. In a girls' school, the girls said, because when they give out to you, giving out is Hiberno English for being reprimanded. Because when they give out to you, you can't concentrate. Well, I can't. You just won't work for them because they're roaring at you. Similarly, a boys' school that was working class and composition said teachers were picking on every single detail. Small bit of noise and they make a big deal. You'd make even more noise then. It's like they're living in the past. And we can see that clearly in this graph, which illustrates a scale of negative interaction with teachers, the frequency of that interaction, as students move from first year of secondary education to their final year. The top line shows the pattern for those students who were in schools with a concentration of working class students, and the others show middle class and socially mixed schools. We can see that there's very little difference when they've just made the transition, so at the beginning of first year, but the difference becomes very large and very wide before narrowing a little bit towards the end of secondary education. Now, what are the implications for policy of some of the findings I've presented? Firstly, I think we need to take account of the multiple factors at family, area and school level which result in inequality in child outcomes in order to develop and target policy interventions. We find that income plays a stronger role than often acknowledged, particularly in Scotland. As a result, there's a need for child-focused policy interventions to be underpinned by broader tax and welfare measures to redistribute resources between families in order to support children's development. It's clear from the findings too that it's not only a matter of what parents do. There is a need to shift away from a deficit view of working class and low income parents to focus more on the resources that are needed to support them in enhancing their children's development. And finally, we need to consider how inequality may be reproduced or even countered by school processes, and to look at ways in which school policy and practice can foster greater equality of educational outcomes for children and young people. Thank you very much.